Hello, this is the second video as part of Seminar 8. We're looking at community and culture. And I just had a phone call, so sorry about the abrupt ending to the first video. I'm just looking at slide 8, and we've just been talking about individualistic and collective cultures and high context and low context, and this slide 8 is just summarising really what some of those differences may mean in the context of working with different people in different cultural settings. And it's really talking about the reluctance for some people who are from a collective culture to ask questions or question a judgment of a superior. May mean that people are hesitant to come forward and hesitant to debate or ask questions. And that for those from an individualistic culture, such as managers, and I would add also community workers, need to look deeply into what they might see as a lack of communication. If people are not speaking, if people are silent, what does that actually mean? What is that actually telling them about communication? And how does one need to modify or be sensitive to their own communication style when someone else's communication is so different? Collective culture will avoid argument, and individualistic culture will use argument to win. So individualistic culture values people being able to be articulate and to have their main points, to be able to communicate, to get their point across and to win. Collective culture will see human relationship as a priority, often over many other things. And individualistic culture sees numeric relationship as a priority. So these concepts of individualistic and collective culture are just a way of thinking about where the cultures we belong to and the culture of those with whom we're working might sit, and to note and to be aware of some fundamental differences that can impact on our communication. We're going to look at briefly a reading that was listed for week 8, and if you haven't read it, I encourage you to read it. That reading is by Barry Chekaway, and it's multicultural participation in an Israeli neighbourhood. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about this because I think it's an important example of some of the ingredients, some of the ways of working in a multicultural and a highly conflictual neighbourhood in a part of Israel, and where they were looking at getting people from different cultural groups and backgrounds to be part of a process where they were coming together. This definition is from Barry Chekaway on slide 10. It's talking about diverse democracy requires people who can discuss their differences and find the common ground among them. And that is what a project in a particular neighbourhood in an urban area was looking at doing. And the particular neighbourhood was a very multicultural neighbourhood. Also was a neighbourhood that was surrounded by really conflictual history, a lot of immigration, a lot of people had come to the area, and also in the lead up to when this particular workshop was being run, there had been a lot of violence, not necessarily in the neighbourhood, but in the surrounding area, where there were 80 shootings, 84 grenade bombings, 20 mortar attacks, 11 casualties, and 4 fatalities. So you get the picture that the people living in this neighbourhood are surrounded by a lot of conflict, and the neighbourhood itself is very diverse. There's Arab Israelis, ultra-religious Jews, old-time Israelis, former Soviet Union immigrants, and Ethiopian immigrants, people living in a really close area. But what often does happen when people migrate to a new area is that they live in an enclave, or they stay very close to the people from their own cultural group. and they may worship with people from that group, continue speaking their language, they shop, they buy their food from people within that cultural group, and there's not always a lot of interaction across the groups. This project was looking at multicultural participation, and they used a metaphor. The metaphor was sitting around the table, and that metaphor is often used to get people to think about sitting around the same table, how that will break down some of the barriers. So that metaphor was used in this project, and the setup of the room reflected that. There was a table set up in the middle of the room, and then tables around the big table, and people sat at the smaller tables with their own cultural groups in the first instance, but that changed over time. Questions were used as part of this project in the workshop to get people thinking about what might be something that they have in common. I'm looking at slide 12, and the questions that were asked were, do we have a common purpose? And if so, what is it? Do we have common ideas? And if so, what is that? One of the things that can be really powerful in community work is effective use of questions. And these questions, you will see immediately have some assumption in there. Do we have a common purpose? And these questions were put to the people attending the workshop, the people who came from at least 5 different cultural backgrounds. And the purpose was not for people to think about their own interests and what would benefit their own cultural group, but to think beyond that and to think about what do we have in common as people from different cultural backgrounds. In the class we had a bit of a discussion about how useful those sorts of questions are and how they can actually drive and create opportunities for people to talk about shared visions or dreams together. And it also highlights that in community work, group work skills are something that good community workers are using all the time. So these questions were the questions that were used as part of this workshop to facilitate people talking about what might be some common ideas. And what actually people came up with after that was, they were actually all committed to having a safe and a good future for their children. The thing that people did have in common was that they cared about kids and that they wanted their kids to grow up in a safe way. I encourage you to read the article because I'm not going to go into it in a lot more detail, but one of the things that Checkaway talks about what makes a process effective, how can you enable multicultural participation to work, is to have the right people there. And I'm looking at slide 13. And one of the things that he talks about is some of the different people who need to be there, who need to be sitting at the table to make a process effective, to make it work. And he talks about leaders need to be there, those who express vision. He talks about facilitators, and facilitators, some of them may or may not have formal training. He also talks about bridging persons, those who can work across cultural boundaries. And you would all know of people like that who are able to relate comfortably with people from different cultures in a respectful way, and people are able to listen to them. So bridging persons, people who are grounded in their own culture but are curious about other cultures and able to speak with people from different backgrounds. Professionals also are useful and can be instrumental, but one of the significant things is that professionals have a significant role, but they don't replace the Indigenous leaders. So the leaders, the facilitators, the bridging persons are the people who come from the community. In this case, they came from the different cultural groups that were represented there. Part of the role of professionals in this process too is to guide and to steer the project, to steer the process. And sometimes that requires the professionals to be quite direct and often to be able to handle conflict, and also often to stop people when conversations or situations are going a little bit out of control. So the professional role is important and is instrumental, but there needs to be these other significant people there as well. These are on slide 14. These are just some questions for you to reflect on after you read this article that's listed as one of the readings for week 8. And just to reflect on what we can learn from a story like this, and what does it say about the importance of skilled workers, and what does the focus on local add to the communication. I'm just very briefly going to refer to a case study that comes from practice of my own work when I was working as a community educator with an Aboriginal legal service that's based in the top end in Darwin. And the focus of this job was to explain to Aboriginal people about the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse. And my job was not to be employed by the Royal Commission, but I was employed by an Aboriginal legal service to go with colleagues to different Aboriginal communities, both in remote and urban settings, and talk to people about what the Royal Commission was and how they could participate in it if they wanted to. So Royal Commission is a federal government initiative, and it's not a court of law, but it's initiated as a Royal Commission and has specific legislation where they are able to go into and explore particular situations, hear people's stories and make recommendations. The outcome of a Royal Commission is usually to make recommendations about how that problem and how that situation can be addressed. And in this case it was, how can we learn from what's happened in the past when children have not been safe in institutional settings and have been abused sexually? What can we learn from that? What can we do to address that problem so that it doesn't happen? So my job was to speak with Aboriginal people and explain what that was about. And I'm just pulling out a couple of things about the work that I did just as recently as last year. And one of the things that was important for me was to be very aware of, I was coming to this job as a white middle class woman, and what that would mean when I met with different people in different settings. And I needed to meet with people in a range of locations, as I said, in urban and also in remote locations, and what that required in different settings was often different things. I needed to link with local services, so find out what services were already there and meet with them. And part of the role was I could provide support if it was needed. I'm looking at slide 16, when I was doing this work, some of the things that I learned very quickly was part of my job as an educator was to acknowledge the history, was to acknowledge what had already happened. And sometimes that might be talking about a previous Royal Commission, sometimes it might be allowing people the space to talk about stolen generation and about children who've been removed, and also it would involve acknowledging culture and how families had responded and how families had been affected by those events in the history. I also really realised early on that I needed to allow people I was talking to identify priorities. And sometimes that meant spending a lot of time sitting with people and allowing people to talk about what are their current worries and what were their current concerns about children right now. So sometimes the conversation would start at one point and it might not be for a few hours, or it might not be for a few weeks, that I would actually get to the point of being able to explain to people about the Royal Commission, that people needed time to learn to trust me, to find out a bit about me, and to talk about what was important for them. Also, I needed to find ways to offer information at a pace in a way that met people's different needs. So the way that I would talk about this very sensitive topic would be different if I met with a group of Aboriginal health workers at a health centre. It may be slightly different to how I might have a conversation with a group of women sitting under a tree who meet regularly to do craft and art. The pace or a conversation might happen in a different way to when I might meet with a group of local mediators. So finding ways to link with the groups that already were meeting was really important. And as I already said too, being prepared to talk about hard stuff meant finding ways to talk about a really sensitive topic. Sometimes involved finding the right people to come with me to have that conversation. I needed to be clear about my role, and I also needed to, when I arrived in a remote community, I needed to ask, who should I be talking to about this? Who is it okay for me to talk to about this? And people were very clear about who I should be talking to, who should be involved. So going back to that example of that multicultural neighbourhood participation in Israel, finding out who the Indigenous leaders are, who are the significant people in the community, that also applies in working in Aboriginal communities. It also might involve me finding out who might be cultural trainers or colleagues. So in certain communities, I was told, Julie, it's better if you go with this person, you take that person with you. Or it's okay if you go and speak to those people on your own. So finding out who are those people was really important. Acknowledging that there are other competing priorities is the last point on slide 17. But it's definitely really important. There are often competing priorities in Aboriginal community work, and those sorts of priorities might be a recent death where there is sorry business and the people that I might have planned to meet are not available. In fact, nobody's available. In fact, it's not a good day to go. In fact, it's not a good week to go. So really being aware of and listening to those priorities is really important. Also acknowledging that people in communities particularly are often experiencing lots of visits from agencies outside of the community or outside of their town, health workers, child protection workers, education workers, specialists. Multiple people come and visit communities all the time. Being aware of that and aware that people have lots of pressures on them and people have commitments and people have other priorities and responsibilities to their family. All of those things can sometimes impact on the work that actually I was wanting to do with people. So being prepared to be flexible was critical. I'm just looking at slide 18 now. Cross-cultural competence. This quote comes from Susan Kenny, and cross-cultural competence refers to the ability to successfully form, foster and improve relationships with members of a culture different from one's own. It aims to avoid cultural blindness or the assumption that all people are the same. And I really like that last sentence. I think cultural blindness is something that as community workers and as humanitarian workers and as social workers we need to be reflecting on all the time about how our own assumptions about how where we come from is affecting how we're interacting with people and challenging that. Slide 19 and 20 have got some reflective points that have come out of some research done by Hilary Weaver. She's a Native American social work academic, And she researched Native American social workers and students, and she asked them what did they think the ingredients were for culturally competent social workers. And these points are what stood out. So, understanding and appreciating diversity within Native populations, having a knowledge of the history, culture and the contemporary realities for the people that you're working with, good general social work skills, as well as strong skills of patience, listening and tolerance of silence. So there's silence coming back again, being prepared to sit with the silence. On slide 20, being aware of one's own bias and need for wellness. So that's very much, again, that focus on one's own cultural assumptions and biases and looking after oneself. Displaying humility and willingness to learn to be respectful, non-judgmental and open-minded. And finally, valuing social justice and the decolonising of one's own thought processes. If you're interested, that's come from, the reference for that is Social Work with Indigenous Communities, a book by Linda Briskman. I'm just going to go back to reflect on my own practice in terms of the importance of us using critical reflection in our work. How are we going to do this in a cross-cultural and a multicultural context? Some of the questions that I found useful in my work are on slide 21. How might my own actions in my work be colonising? You know, when did I expect people to see things the way that I saw them? A really big and significant point of reflection for me. And how do my own assumptions shape my work? And for me, that is, as a white, Anglo, middle-class female, how are those assumptions impacting on how I interact with people? How does my own focus effectively exclude others or other views? I can be very focused and expect to have particular answers and expect people to respond in a particular way. But how can that actually prevent others from expressing different views or wanting to deal with particularly difficult issues in a different way? And what preconceived ideas do I have that create barriers to others? These questions are useful. They might be more relevant to me. Someone else might have slightly different questions according to the work that you're doing and the context of the work and the type of work you're doing. However, our ability to reflect on who we are in our work role as community workers, as social workers, as humanitarian workers will impact on our effectiveness. And that's the end of this seminar. Thank you.